France's yellow vest protesters have caused French President Emmanuel Macron to redline his proposed fuel tax. The reform does spark the violent movement. Are the protesters satisfied? What's the impact on Macron's leadership? And Chinese President Xi Jinping wrapped up his visit to Portugal this week. How are the two countries collaborating on a people-to-people level? I visited the second largest Portuguese city of Porto to sit down with its mayor to find out. Welcome to The Point, live from Beijing. I'm Bixin. Now, France is no stranger to protests, but there is an exception in the protests that have swept France over the past 3 weeks. These protesters, known as Gilets jaunes or yellow vests, do not have any links to French trade unions, which usually organize protests. They've taken to the streets across the country, setting fires, looting shops and smashing windows in increasingly violent moves to vent their anger against the reformist President Emmanuel Macron over the price hikes of gasoline and diesel fuel. The controversial policy had been slated to come into effect on January the 1st next year, but French Prime Minister Edouard Philippe on Tuesday announced a moratorium as the street riots, which are believed to be the most severe in decades since 1968, have left at least 3 people dead and more than 600 injured. Meanwhile, the Yellow Vests have vowed to continue their protests. So what exactly is the movement asking for at this stage? And for Macron, who had repeatedly vowed not to give in, how will he manage the unrest and his presidency? I'm joined by Dr. Oliver Davis in the French Studies Department at the University of Warwick in Coventry in the UK. Professor Douglas Yates is going to join us from the American Graduate School in Paris in just a moment. But Mr. Shan Saeed, Chief Economist at IQI Global Malaysia, joining us from Kuala Lumpur. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Now, Dr. Davis, let me go to you first. Now, reports say that the tax proposed by Macron aims to curb the consumption of diesel and other polluting fuels and to favor electric cars with the aim of fighting climate change. And the cost of diesel, according to France's Oil Industry Federation, has surged 16% this year, and another 6.5 cents per litre to diesel and 2.9 cents per litre to gasoline were slated to be added on that price, but have now been suspended for 6 months. How do you think President Macron have changed his attitude? In the beginning, he was quite defiant. Now he has agreed to a moratorium to this latest tax.
Yes, well, Emmanuel Macron and his government have always been adamant that they wouldn't change the course of their policy in response to street protests. So this first concession, and I think it is a first concession, this freeze or moratorium on the scheduled rises, is a major climb down by the government, and it cannot but make Macron and his government seem weaker.
Well, what was the problem to start with, Mr. Saeed? Has Macron been too radical in the pace of his reform agenda? What has been his intention behind these reforms, and how have they upset the people who are now on the streets?
I think President Macron has not been consistent in his economic policy, and there's a huge leadership issue in France at the moment. If you see, France right now is facing economic and structural issues that has led to the protest of these people. But at the same time, President Macron has taken the economy very lightly. Economy cannot be played like a piano, that you press fiscal notes or monetary notes or structural notes to get standard solution. Economics or economy is a combination of complex variables, and the government's job is to provide a framework in order to provide economic, social and economic empowerment. At the same time, rising income level can actually bring about prosperity. I think President Macron has failed to deliver that, and that's why there is a sense of despondency among people in France.
Well, it's also been said that President Macron has to meet the EU target of keeping the deficit, the government deficit, under 3% of the GDP. Now that he has suspended the green tax, he will have to get money from somewhere else, and billions of euros from somewhere else, which is likely to affect the social services that the people who are the protesters cherish very much too. So, Dr. Davis, are we in the situation where the protesters or the French people want to have their cake and eat it at the same time?
Well, so one of the demands made in recent days by the protesters is to have some changes to a tax, the ISF tax, which is a tax for the super rich, essentially. So Macron had adjusted this tax to make it less burdensome for the super rich, and what was announced this morning is that they are going to reconsider those changes. So that would potentially raise a certain amount of money, but I think, as I mentioned, I think there are going to be many more concessions by the Macron government over the next few days and weeks.
Well, one of the biggest grievances of the protesters is that Macron is accused for being in favor of the rich. As you said, he introduced, since he came into power, this flat tax for capital income, which is believed to have benefited the rich and not at all benefited the poor, instead made life more difficult for those who are just barely making their ends meet. So, Mr. Saeed, what do you think was his intention to start with? He wanted to bring business back to France, apparently, but was this carried out in the wrong pace, that he was doing things too fast, too quickly, or what is the problem here?
I think he has used a wrong strategy. The number one issue with France right now is economic confidence. When you don't have economic confidence in the economy, you won't be able to raise taxes, you won't be able to get revenues from people. And the most effective way of raising tax to GDP ratio is by increasing the GDP size. In the last 4 to 5 years, France's GDP size has remained stagnant as $2.6, $2.7 trillion. It is not building up. The productivity levels of many French people are not at par with market forces. That is forcing people to come out on streets, and they are not willing to pay taxes. And if you see youth unemployment, which is over 10%, that is really hurting the economy. So I think President Macron has used wrong strategy that is not going in his favor. In fact, it is going against him, and that is not helping the cause. And at the same time, I would like to say that economy has not really taken a boost, because in the next 5 to 10 years, only those economies will actually spur growth where people and the governments are technology savvy. Unfortunately, in France, the productivity levels are much below as compared to Germany, or even for that matter, Netherlands.
Okay.
So I think productivity is a huge issue. They are not tech savvy.
Yeah, let me bring in our third guest, Professor Douglas Yates from the American Graduate School in Paris. Professor Yates, thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to have your insight here. So, where does that huge anger coming from? Is it because President Macron had the wrong policy to raise tax instead of cutting spending, as some people have suggested? Has he been too fast, too radical in his pace? Has he been faced with this dilemma between attracting big businesses and making France more competitive, and keeping the social welfare level high, as high as always? What is the source of the huge anger here?
Well, I mean, I think you've hit on it. It's a combination of different types of discontent. One of the interesting things we've seen is the robotype, the portrait of these protesters. These are not the typical protesters who come out who are progressive and want positive change, or who are angry right-wing protesters, but they seem to be a mix of people who never got involved in protest activity before. And they're coming from peripheral places, peri-urban areas, distant suburbs, secondary cities, rural areas. These are people who have not been listened to, people who feel as though their voice
but
doesn't count.
Who are these people exactly? Can you put a tag on? I hate this tag word, but can you describe them? Are they the rural working class? Are they the people who have not been heard? You said they have not been heard, but who exactly are they?
Yeah, so if, for example, we were to look at the portraits of people who were arrested, there were several hundred people arrested, and they were brought in and they were questioned, because here we have some information about them. They were unusual. So most of the people arrested were, of course, men. They were between the ages of 20 and 40. And 40 is quite old to be involved in vandalism and these kinds of activities. Most of them had not come in from the Paris area, but had come in from regional towns, second-tier towns, smaller towns. They had come several hours by train from Brittany, from Picardy, from the areas around Troyes.
So what does
and
that
these
say?
Are cities that
what does that say about this movement?
What it said, there's been a big concentration of the government on the big cities, the big city mayors, the areas that are politically and economically important. And they've cut social services, they've cut train stations, small train routes. These are people who basically have seen their social services removed. Their post offices are closed. Their schools are closed. They live in towns where there's no more commerce, and they have to get in cars and drive an hour, 2 hours, and thus these people very much are dependent on their automobiles.
So what I do not understand is, Dr. Davis, let me go to you. When President Macron was elected, he had a very high support rate. What turnaround so fast, so quickly, now that his support rate is in the lower 20s?
Well, I think everything up to about now, or until the end of October, had been going very much according to his own plan. You know, he conducted, before he stood for office, an extremely technically sophisticated set of focus group researches in order to be able to frame his policies and to present his policies in the most attractive way possible. And I think up until you know, around a month and a bit ago, pretty much everything had been going according to plan. I mean, it's worth bearing in mind that his political party, La République En Marche, is in a sense a kind of, if you like, a kind of pop-up party formed from people who hadn't been in politics before, but also from people from other mainstream parties, and it really has reconfigured the political spectrum. I think what we could see the Gilets jaunes movement as a kind of corresponding coalescence, if you like, of the working class and lower middle class, and also, as has been said by another of your contributors, the kind of the rural poor, working poor as well. So it's, if you like, a kind of symmetrical coalescence to La République En Marche.
Okay, let me go to Mr. Saeed in Kuala Lumpur. I want to ask you this one, because there is one piece of graffiti that has featured prominently in some news report that is found on Arc de Triomphe, which says the people are against the regime. What is happening there? What is the message being expressed here?
As I said earlier, youth unemployment is over 10%. And look at the demographics. People who are protesting are between the age bracket of 20 and 40. This boils down to economics everywhere. When people, they don't have jobs, they don't have food, they don't have sense of purpose to their life, it's an excruciating agony. And this is a classic case study where economic growth leaves a country where government is shaky, government cannot provide economic confidence, and government does not have economic strategy in order to spur growth. And because of this, people are not happy with President Macron and his economic policies, because he has not been instilling confidence in the economy.
Okay, thank you very much. We have to leave it there. Dr. Oliver Davis in the French Studies Department at the University of Warwick in Coventry in the UK, and Mr. Shan Saeed, Chief Economist at IQI Global Malaysia in Kuala Lumpur. You have been watching The Point with me, Li Xin. We'll take a short break, and when we come back, Portugal and China agree to boost trade ties and other links during Chinese President Xi Jinping Jinping's two-day visit. How else are these two countries cooperating on a local level? Earlier, I sat down with the mayor of Porto, the second largest city in Portugal, to find out. The city of Porto was built along the hillsides overlooking the mouth of the Douro River. Selected as the best European destination for 3 years, what has made the city stand out so much among so many other European cities? Located on the two sides of the Eurasia continent, how can Chinese and Portuguese better connect with each other? Earlier, I was in the Portuguese city of Porto and I met the city's mayor, Rui Moreira. I started by asking him what makes Porto so special that it has been selected as a UNESCO World Heritage Site and 3 times Europe's best tourist destination.
Porto is a comfortable and interesting city. It's not too big. By Chinese standards, it's a very small city. It has an heritage. It's a very young city in terms of its population because we have a big university. And this combination of heritage and of a modern living style, I think, makes Porto a unique city. Also the fact that it's one of the safest cities in Europe. Actually, Portugal is the 3rd safest country in the world, and Porto is the safest city in Portugal. So I think for tourists who these days are very concerned about their safety, and safety in terms of everything, of climate changes and everything else, I think it makes Porto very attractive. And then, of course, the lifestyle. I think people enjoy coming here, enjoying our wines, our gastronomy, our history, but then looking at everything which is modern and which is happening with our theaters, with our collections, with our art. And I think that's what makes this sort of combination of a city which was basically a hidden treasure until a few years ago, because we kept the city closed for too long.
Well, I mentioned 3 times Europe's best
Yes.
tourist destination, and all of these 3 times happened in the past, let's say, 6, 7 years.
Yes.
So indeed, it was a hidden treasure that newly discovered. What did it mean for you as the mayor of the city? You came into this position in 2013, October, and then you were re-elected for the 2nd term last year. What did it mean to you to help the world discover the hidden beauties of Porto?
Well, we thought basically when we came, when I decided to run for mayor, that this treasure had to be shown for the benefit of its own citizens. A lot of cities want to stay close because they think that bringing newcomers, foreigners, affects the traditions. It's not true as long as you have a strong cultural background. So you have to work on the local culture to guarantee that it's the foundation of the city and of the society, and then you should not be afraid to open up. And I think we did open up, and what we did first of all was to build a brand for the city. The city did not have a brand. We were known by different names. O Porto by the British, Porto by ourselves, and our wine was called Port. So imagine having 3 names. It made no sense.
What did you do?
So basically we worked on the brand of Porto Dot, which these days won a lot of prizes. We were inspired a little bit in things like I Love New York from years ago, but we decided to keep only one name, to concentrate on one image. And this image and this Porto Dot, the dot is actually the combination of everything we have, which sort of expands into the culture, into the gastronomy, into the lifestyle, into the traditions as well, because the Porto citizens are very proud of their traditions. So we had to be sure that on opening the city, we at the same time were inspired to keep the traditions. And that's a difficult combination, actually. What
does your interaction with China mean for all of the things you try to achieve here?
Well, as you know, the relationship between Portugal and China is a fantastic history of a fantastic relationship where we were always friends. We were always on the good side. We exchanged a lot of cultural values. And when I came in, I found out that we had a relationship, namely with Shanghai, which was basically dormant. It had not been developed. Also with Macau, for reasons that everyone understands, because Macau was a Portuguese administered territory for a while. And then we also looked at the new cities. We looked at Shenzhen as a target. And we started exchanging visits. We started visiting Shanghai, visiting Beijing as well, as you know, where we met, visiting Macau, and also promoting trade, promoting values, promoting culture. And
what
so,
has come out of those exchanges? Any concrete results?
well, you can see some concrete reasons. It's not really the job of the mayor of a city, of course, to promote individual products. But the fact is, when we look now at the trade figures between the north of Portugal and China, and some things like, for instance, beer, which is something which made little sense a few years ago. Now we have Superboc. I know that
beer, yeah.
Beer.
Sure.
The wine, Portuguese wine. Last time I was in Beijing, I arrived at the hotel, I looked for a bottle of wine. There was Portuguese wine there from the Porto district. Something which we could not find years ago. On the textile, we find that whereas we buy a lot of textiles from China, we are also able to export garments and textiles. And then, of course, the cultural aspect, which is so important. And also on the tourism side, because the fact that Porto is today known in China, it wasn't a few years ago, has enabled a lot of Chinese to find that they want to discover Porto, they want to discover our river, they want to discover our vineyards, they want to and that's something which is also very interesting, because we have a very strong Chinese community in Porto and around Porto. One of the most, we are at the moment protecting what we call heritage shops and restaurants. One of the first to be recognized was a Chinese restaurant which has existed in the city for 40 years.
Really?
It is considered as a heritage of the city. Imagine, it's also almost a museum shop, which is a Chinese restaurant.
Then.
You have to go there. It's very good.
It's
extremely good. So it is also because of the Chinese community, which is so active in the region of Porto and the north, that we really want to foster this relationship, because we know for them they have like two nationalities. They are still Chinese, but they want to be citizens of Porto. And their kids are in school, and for their kids, the relationship we are building with China makes them, of course, very proud, because they have this double feeling of pertaining.
Sure. Well, in terms of Chinese investment, what has been the areas that Chinese investors are most looking at, and what has been the impact of their investment here in Porto?
Well, as you know, when we started with the project of privatizations, recent projects of privatization some years ago, the Chinese investors have bought some of the biggest companies in Portugal. And this is something the Portuguese appreciate very much, because it was at the time when the rest of the world was suspecting that Portugal was not viable. When you decided to buy the electrical company EDP, which is so strong in Porto, it was for us, that company started in Porto, was founded in Porto. It was very important. The insurance company like Fidelidade, who is one of the main stakeholders of the city in terms of property, with REN. But also now, looking at the business in food, there's a lot of Chinese investors in things like canning industries, food industries. Also on textiles and garments, there are a lot of people showing interest. So there is a lot of, and the Portuguese economy is very open, as you know, and we very much appreciate that Chinese economy is today also very open when we compare it with the United States, which is closing its borders. We see very favorably how China is opening its borders. So I think there is a lot of potential.
Any measures to further welcome or facilitate Chinese investment here in Porto, in Portugal, for your side, or also welcoming Chinese tourists? If you want to attract them, you have to make them feel comfortable, the facilities, the signs, I don't know, the language, for instance, what is being done there to make it a sustainable business?
To develop more Chinese tourism in Porto, we need basically direct flights. This has been on our agenda, on the agenda of the Portuguese Prime Minister, also on the agenda of the Chinese ambassador in Lisbon, who I visited several times. And this was one of the key issues when I last visited China. Whereas Lisbon has had, and it has stopped recently, flights between Beijing and Lisbon. We would like very much to have flights between Shanghai and Porto. We have local people interested in that venture. That is the key, because a lot of Chinese who want to come to Porto, they do not want to fly via intermediate airports, which are not comfortable. Also for me, who I travel very often to China, I would travel more often if I could have direct flights. So that's the main target. Until the target is achieved, there is not much more we can do. But what we see, especially on the river, especially the people who start in Porto and go up the river and down the river and want to see the vineyards. More and more Chinese are coming, and they are very curious about it. Some of them are interested in buying properties, small properties in the city, and we are very open to that.
Porto, you mentioned the wine, the port wine, which is also very famous here. The Chinese love good wine. They are also in a search of quality food and beverage from around the world. So what is being done to make the story of port more accessible, more enjoyable to the Chinese consumers?
What I have seen, and I saw it almost by coincidence, one of the last times I was in Macau, I was in one of the hotels, and there was a presentation of a Portuguese wine. And I decided to look into it, to see how they were organizing it. And suddenly I saw a lot of Portuguese exporters, a couple of Portuguese exporters, and they were really inviting chefs of very renowned restaurants in China, not only in Macau, and also people who had small shops in China, and they were trying to tell them what is port, the story of port, because I think more and more for the Chinese consumer they do not want only a good product, but they want the history associated to that product, the story.
Yeah.
That's a very specific angle that the Chinese consumer looks, is the history behind. And I think that's being done extremely in a very efficient way. Of course, port has a small production. And one of the things that port misses when it is in China is we have to understand it's not like selling Campari, which is produced industrially. Port is produced, is handmade, is like a treasure, is like a jewel. And so we have to look at specific targets. We can't look at the broad market because we just don't have enough production.
Yeah. Finally, looking as a commentator, looking at the exchanges China is having with its partners around the world, what would you say is the most important thing that we need to keep in mind in terms of making people understand each other better, breaking down barriers?
What we have to bear in mind is open commercial exchanges are will be the main, I think the main tool to keep the world safe. If we decide to start closing our borders, if we start into trade wars, normally we will end up with a problem. The other thing we have to do is to look at the planet and to look at some continents which are having a lot of problems, and I know exactly how much China has been investing in Africa. That's a very good example for the Europeans. When you look at the migration problems we are facing in Europe, it is happening because we have not been able to create jobs there, to create capacities there. So I think the common goal for Europe and China would be to capacitate these populations in countries like the Middle East, like Africa, where if we give them the chance, if we give them the tools, they will be happier. We will have a less dangerous world. We will have a more open world. And I think the Chinese are doing a fantastic job in that respect.
Thank you very much,
My
Mr.
pleasure.
Rui Moreira, the Mayor of the city of Porto.
My pleasure.
And with that, we come to the end of this edition of The Point with me, Li Xin. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with LX. Download the application called CGTN to watch the show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.